So General, you've got a book coming out.
I do.
Radical Inclusion. Tell us a little bit about your book and the thematic of the book and what we can learn from it.
Well, I'll tell you why I wrote it. I wrote it, I mean, part of it was I was being mischievous, really. I mean, I retired, and I wanted to write a leadership book, but I didn't want it to be just about military leadership, because that would make me feel better, but I'm not sure it would have the impact that I wanted it to have. So I reached out to an individual who I'd known at Berkeley. Here's where the mischievous part, the little leprechaun in me came out. Because his name is Ori Brafman. He's a wonderful, thoughtful adjunct professor at Berkeley, but he's also his particular academic niche is peace studies, and he's a vegan. Now think about that. I'm coming out of West Point, the most hierarchical institution, I would challenge you, potentially in the land, and have spent my entire life trying to understand how to propagate war if it becomes necessary. But he brought with him a wonderful feel, really, for leadership in the business sector, and I brought a feel for leadership in national security. And so we wrote this book, and our thesis, I don't want to bang on about this because it'll sound like it's turning into a sales pitch, but the reason we became passionate about the phrase radical inclusion is that for all the reasons I mentioned in my prepared remarks about how do you establish a sense of belonging with a team in order to solve these really complex, fast-moving problems, we think the answer is you have to have a real instinct for radical inclusion. You have to think about inclusion in a much more aggressive fashion than just, well, we'd really like a few partners to throw a few dollars on the table.
Can you give us what it's like, a day in the life of the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff? I mentioned before, General Bradley, General Powell. I mean, this is a very high office in our land. Is there a prototypical day that you can share with the audience?
Yeah, I mean, the day was always, it's certainly a full day. I mean, it would start at, 5:30 in the morning, and most nights there's something that I either had to do myself. Most often, Deanie and I would do. We did a lot of counterpart entertaining in our home. So the day would start at 5:30 and end at, 10:30 maybe. And so you have to have a partner who's willing to actually be a part of the, would have been, if I had to constantly kind of drag Deanie into the game, it had been a long 4 years. A typical day, though, is one where there's two responsibilities the chairman has. He has to give advice to the SecDef SecDef, the President, the National Security Council, and the Congress of the United States. And now we consult with the Congress, we give advice to the executive branch. So every day there was some opportunity, some requirement to do that. So, sometimes on matters as mundane as budget, and other times on matters of operational capabilities, troop strength in Iraq and Afghanistan, deployment of Navy ships, whether we had the right number of submarines and carriers deployed, and sometimes on issues related to the kind of the core of the institution, the profession. So, women in service, for example, women in combat, those kind of things. That's one side of it. The other side of it is you are the steward of the profession. So we're a profession, which means we're volunteers who volunteer to live to a particular ethos. Sometimes we do that better than others. Sometimes we have problems with that. And the chairman has to recognize when the problems are just individual problems or whether they become institutional problems. Things, for example, the issue of sexual assault in the military. That was an institutional problem, as opposed to a particular individual experiencing some indiscipline and misconduct for which we had to pass him over the side. And then the other thing is, it's related to that, the chairman's kind of a referee, because you got the Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, and in fact the Coast Guard competing for resources. And when the competition can't be resolved by them, it comes to the chairman. And so, there was a lot of that every day, too.
And being an Army man, you were able to play that fairly?
Yeah, truthfully, I think that the chairman generally does less for his own service than he does for the others because he doesn't want to have a reputation for being parochial. So I probably erred on the side of the other services, which is fine. I mean, we should do that.
What are we doing in Afghanistan? What does the future look like? How long are we going to be there?
When I was in Iraq and Afghanistan, General John Abizaid, who commanded CENTCOM at Tampa for 4 years, he was over there a long time. He and I had that conversation because I had just come out of Saudi Arabia. And we both said that, based on our experience in the Arab and Muslim world, we both said, for one thing, we can't be in those areas with really large troop concentrations for two reasons. One is they get, the very people you're trying to help get them back on their feet are more than happy to let you do the work. They just are. And the second thing is we do generate antibodies. This isn't like the U.S. Army in Europe occupying Germany for 50 years. It's not like that. For one thing, in Afghanistan, besides the division of Uzbeks, Tajiks, Pashtu, Baluchs, every valley, from one valley to the next, is a different tribe, and none of them like each other. But the only thing they agree on is they don't like us very much. So we have to be there. We should be there. We should be there I'll take Afghanistan. Two reasons. One is we really have to be alert that it could turn back into a safe haven. And because the religion there, and in particular on the other side of the border in Pakistan, is really radical. It's a radical form, at least in the parts of Western Afghanistan, Pakistan can be pretty radical. So we got to be there, eyes and ears, with enough to protect ourselves and enough to help the Afghans do what they got to do. And we should be there because of Pakistan. Pakistan, 170 million, by now probably 180 million, with nuclear weapons, on the edge with India all the time, and generating these madrasas and things that can be against our long-term interests. So we have interest there. We just have to be, determined and persevere, make sure we have enough to protect ourselves and our interests, make sure that they are doing what they have to do. And we have levers we can pull to do that. But we should not be there or in Iraq and believe that we own and somehow control the entire outcome, because we don't.
Right next door in Iraq and in parts of Syria, ISIS had established a territorial hold. There was talk of ISIS creating a new caliphate in the Middle East.
Right.
And through our efforts and the efforts of our allies, we were largely able to beat that back. They're now basically concentrated in one geographical area. What is the future of ISIS? Are they an al-Qaeda that will work through a disparate group of places, or are we going to see them try to obtain territory again?
Well, I mentioned that ISIS is now kind of a meme. It's an idea that spreads mostly through social media, and by the way, and can radicalize people inside of what are otherwise stable borders like our own. I mean, while we're sitting here, there's a ideology being passed across in cyberspace that people who become desperate or disenfranchised can be seduced by it. But your larger question is related to the fact that the Middle East all of the countries in the Middle East are destabilized in some way or another. Syria is the worst, but the institutions that hold a nation together, whether it's their governance, whether it's their ministries and cabinets, whether it's their education system, it's that which produces oil and revenue, and all of those systems are fragile and in some cases broken. So this is a case where the military is really not the answer. It's not the answer. It can be helpful in establishing a certain amount of stability to allow others, again, the community of nations. I always argued that NATO, the people that are most affected by the refugee flow are Southern Europeans, our NATO allies. So I always argued on the halls of NATO that NATO ought to look to its southern border and try to stabilize it, not by putting up a fence or by putting patrol boats in the Mediterranean, but by getting involved in the Middle East and North Africa with its resources and its military, and that we would be part of that. What happened was, just about when I thought I had them persuaded, Russia attacked into Ukraine, and the Europeans completely flipped and started to worry about their eastern flank. And that's really the problem, is you've got Europe divided on whether the problem with Russia is more serious than the problem with refugees. And we just got to help them figure it out.
Two final questions for you. These are from the audience. One of them, which is dear to my heart. Jim Ziegler asked a question about your predecessor, Mike Mullen. And actually, I was on the Armed Services Committee when he made this testimony. He said the biggest threat to our national security was the national debt. Right now, we're at $20 trillion.
Yeah.
Looks like we'll see what happens tonight, whether or not we get a budget deal. The budget deal that the Senate has put forward is sort of money for everybody. The Republicans get more for defense, the Democrats get more for domestic spending. What's your view of the national debt and its impact on national security?
In 2008, we went through the recession. When I became chairman in 2011, we were just starting to climb back out. And the president pulled the chiefs and I into the sit room and said, look, you got to help me solve this problem. And what he meant was clear, which was defense has to be part of helping us climb out of the recession. You can't, he was telling us, you can't come over here and tell us we need, twice what we're offering, because then you're going to be, you're going to, first of all, and he was right. He said, the American people are going to start to scratch their heads if, the bridges all start collapsing in West Virginia, and you're arguing that you need 60 billion more. So he said, what I need you to do is tell me what you need, not what you want. And we did, frankly, and we did contribute. Now, the reason, Senator, that it's hard for me to answer your question today is that we're out of that recession. And in fact, the economy is doing quite well, although those of you that watch the Dow Jones Industrial Average every day are probably ready to pull your hair out. But we've climbed out. The economy is doing well, for sure. And as you know, there are just as many economists who would tell you that when interest rates are low, you should borrow money. And that's what we're doing. We're borrowing money on the bet that the interest rates will stay low, which is why the market is freaked out right now, because there's fears of inflation. But the bet we're making is that inflation will stay low, interest rates will stay low, the economy will get hotter, meaning in a positive way, and the debt will become less important. Now, you asked me a question, what do I think? I don't know. I'm an Army guy, not an economist. But what I do know is that
your predecessor was in the Navy. He had opinions.
Yeah. No, what I do know is that debt is good to a point, meaning it's not all that bad that China holds a bunch of our debt, because they'd probably be less likely to try to bring us down because they're actually bringing themselves down. So that's a good thing. I just don't know where the balance point is. I don't. But I do know what this administration, the path they're pursuing, and hopefully there will be a good, zesty debate about how risky that is before it gets really risky.